Dear learners, good day. In this module, we will be discussing the role of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, an overview. We've already discussed about the President and his powers, functions, roles and responsibilities in an earlier module. Recollecting that module, we will be revisiting the concept of a Union Executive. Under Article 52 to 78 of the Constitution, there are provisions pertaining to the Union Executive. As we've already discussed, the Union Executive comprises of the President, the Vice President, the Prime Minister, the Council of Ministers, the Attorney General of India. So these are the 5 entities that form part of the Union Executive. We also have seen that the head of the state of India is the President under Article 52. So what is the position of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers? In India, the Union Executive is premised and based upon the system of the British Westminster, while having both a head of a state and a head of the government. The head of the state, as we have already discussed, is the President, who is the nominal or de jure executive. On the other hand, we have the head of the government, that is the Prime Minister, that is the real or de facto executive. So in India, the position of the President is similar to that of the British Crown, subject to certain exceptions and conditions. When we speak of the position of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, the articles that we will be discussing are from 74 to 78 of the Constitution. What are these provisions and what do they envisage? That is what we will be taking up. Article 74 of the Constitution talks about the Council of Ministers and its role to advise and aid the President. Article 75 reads other provisions as to ministers. Article 76 deals with the Attorney General of India, who is the topmost law officer of the nation. Article 77 deals with the conduct of business of the government of the Union. And Article 78, last but not the least, deals with the duties of the Prime Minister as respect the furnishing of information to the President, as to the role of the Prime Minister as a mediator, as a link, as a communication channel between the Council of Ministers and the President. So we will be discussing the first concept of Prime Minister, his appointment, his position, his term of office and his role and functions. So first things first, the appointment of the Prime Minister. Under Article 75, the Constitution clearly tells us that it is the President of India who appoints the Prime Minister. Constitutionally speaking, there is no specific procedure mentioned for the appointment of the Prime Minister under the Indian Constitution. However, constitutional conventions, that is, form of customary practices that have evolved, that have been culled out from the British parliamentary form of government, are also applicable to India for the purposes of appointment of Prime Minister. So what are those conventions? The convention is that inevitably it is the leader of the majority party in the Lok Sabha who gets to become the Prime Minister of India. And what will happen if there is no clear majority party in the Lok Sabha? So in these cases, the President has certain additional role to play. His discretion has to be exercised in accordance with prevalent established constitutional conventions. So it is the President who will be calling for various people to become appointed as the Prime Minister in a case wherein there is no clear-cut majority or leader of the majority party, the Lok Sabha. So in this case, what will happen is that it is the leader of the single largest party or the coalition who will be then required to prove their majority through a confidence motion in the parliament will get to become the Prime Minister. So he will be called upon to become the Prime Minister on the condition that they establish their support in the Lok Sabha by proving that the Lok Sabha has confidence in them through what we call as the confidence motion. So essentially, we can see that it is the President who appoints the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister should command the support of the majority of the Lok Sabha. What is the other requirements of the Prime Minister? We can clearly see that the Prime Minister can be a member of either house of the Parliament. He may be a member of the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. So in India, there is no restriction for the Prime Minister to become one from the Rajya Sabha itself. This is unlike Britain or Great Britain, where the Prime Minister necessarily has to be a member of the House of Commons, that is the lower house, for him to adorn the position of the Prime Minister. In India, that is not the case, and a member of parliament of either the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha can go on to become the Prime Minister of our nation. Now, the next important topic is the tenure of the Prime Minister. What is the tenure of the Prime Minister? Does the Constitution specify any particular duration, and what are the rules and affiliated conditions pertaining to the tenure of the Prime Minister? So, in respect to the term of the Prime Minister, it is clear that the term is not fixed, and the Prime Minister holds office during the pleasure of the President. Inevitably, it means that a person who is elected as a member of parliament as part of the Lok Sabha position will go on to hold prime ministerial position for a period of 5 years, unless and until in the meantime, he loses the support of the Lok Sabha or his government is otherwise toppled. So what it means is that though because of the duration of the membership of parliament being 5 years, particularly the Lok Sabha, we are saying that the position of the Prime Minister is for 5 years, but constitutionally speaking, the position of the Prime Minister is on the pleasure of the President. So what it means, the concept of the pleasure of the President is derived from the English doctrine of pleasure of the Crown. So what it entails is that a person who is elected as a Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, they hold office only and only so long as they continue to enjoy the pleasure of the President or the Crown in case of Britain. The moment the pleasure of the President is withdrawn, the persons who are in the position of the Prime Minister will lose their position as one. So what it means is that the President is empowered to dismiss the Prime Minister in certain circumstances. So what are those circumstances? Essentially those situations wherein a particular Prime Minister and a Council of Ministers have lost the support of the Lok Sabha and still refuse to resign. In such cases, the President is empowered to dismiss him or revoke his pleasure. So other than that, the Prime Minister who enjoys the support of the majority of the Lok Sabha cannot be dismissed by the President in India. So the only condition in which the Prime Minister can be dismissed from office by the President is when he loses the confidence of the Lok Sabha, in which case he is usually, as a matter of parliamentary practice, expected to resign from his office voluntarily, and if he refuses to resign even after losing the confidence of the Lok Sabha, in such cases the President is empowered to dismiss his cabinet and the Council of Ministers. So essentially we can see that the position of the Prime Minister can be altered by virtue of either the death of the Prime Minister or his resignation or his dismissal by the President. So what happens is that the moment a President or rather the Prime Minister dies or resigns or he is otherwise dismissed, all the other members of the Council of Ministers also lose their position. So they derive their powers and they owe their existence to the Prime Minister himself. In the absence of the Prime Minister, the other members of the Council of Ministers cannot continue to operate independently. So it is why we say that the Council of Ministers and the Prime Minister sail together or sink together. Now moving ahead, what are the roles and functions of the Prime Minister? Ivar Jennings says that the role of the Prime Minister is akin to a sun around which the planets revolve. He is the keystone of the Constitution and all roads in the Constitution lead to the Prime Minister. So broadly we can see that the Prime Minister enjoys several powers as the head of the Union of the Council of Ministers. What are the powers that are enjoyed by the Prime Minister? First and foremost is the power to appoint other ministers of his council. That is, it is only based upon the recommendation of the Prime Minister, the President appoints other members of his ministry or his council of ministers. And at the same time, he is empowered to allocate and reshuffle portfolios amongst the ministers based upon their performance and their discharging of duties. Thirdly, just like how he has the power to appoint, he has the power to seek the resignation or advise the president to remove a particular minister who is not functioning up to the mark as per his expectations. So he has the power both to appoint as well as remove members of the ministry as part of his council of ministers. And number 4, he presides over the meetings of the council of ministers and he influences its decisions. The Prime Minister is said to be the first among equals in the entirety of the council of ministers and the cabinet, but nevertheless he is the steering wheel of the concept of the government of the state. Thus, he guides, directs, controls and coordinates the activities of all the ministers of his government in a unanimous manner. And last but not the least, he has the power to pull the trigger upon the entire council of ministers. He can bring about a collapse of the council of ministers by resigning from his office as the position of the Prime Minister. So these are the several important cardinal functions that a Prime Minister does, particularly in relation to his duties in conjunction with the Council of Ministers. So moving ahead, what is the role of the Prime Minister as a link, as a chain, as a connecting point between the President and the other members of the Council of Ministers? The first point to be noted as per the Constitution in itself is that the Prime Minister acts as a principal channel of communication between the Council of Ministers relating to the administration of the affairs of the Union and proposals for legislation. So whatever proposals, whatever policy measures, whatever major decisions are taken or are mooted by the Cabinet or the Council of Ministers, it is the Prime Minister who takes those decisions, those policy matters to the President and keeps him updated and abreast of the developments within the Council of Ministers. Number 2, he is required to furnish information relating to the administration of the affairs of the Union and proposals for legislation as the President may call for. So, and at the same time, the President is empowered to seek information from the Prime Minister regarding the working of the Council of Ministers, regarding the administrative matters, as well as the proposals for legislations that are being mooted by the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers from the President himself. And thirdly, he is empowered, that is, the President is empowered to require the Prime Minister to submit for consideration before the Council of Ministers any matter wherein a decision has been taken by a minister but which has not been considered by the Council. So what it means is that an individual decision of the Minister of the Council of Ministers can be placed for consensus or for decision making by majority before the entire Council of Ministers at the behest of the President in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. So this role is also done by the President through the Prime Minister, broadly speaking. And nextly, in respect of various important appointment powers that are enjoyed by the President, it is in fact the Prime Minister who recommends the appointment by the President of various high profile constitutional officers, including that of the Attorney General of India, who is the topmost law officer of the nation under Article 76. Similarly, we have provisions pertaining to the appointment of the Comptroller and Auditor General, who is the topmost auditor of the nation, and similarly the position of chairman and members of the Union Public Service Commission, as well as chairman and members of the Election Commission of India, all of which is done by the President at the behest of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. Similarly, the chairperson of the Finance Commission is also appointed by the President at the behest of the Prime Minister. So, moving ahead, what is the role of the Central Council of Ministers? As yet, we have discussed the Prime Minister, his position, his tenure, his roles and responsibilities within the parliamentary setup of things. Now, what is the role of his Council of Ministers in terms of running the government within the parliamentary form of government? So, in order to understand this, we will be discussing Article 74 to 78 of the Constitution. Article 74 talks about the status of the Council of Ministers, that there shall always be a Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister that shall aid and advise the President. So it is not the Prime Minister individually, but it is the collective body of the Council of Ministers that serves as the steering wheel for the government through the driver, that is the President. So following this, we have Article 75, which talks about the appointment of ministers, including the Prime Minister, the tenure of all the ministers, the responsibility of the ministers, their qualifications, oath, salaries and allowances, and so on and so forth. Right. So what is important to understand is that following the 42nd and the 44th Constitution Amendment Act, the Constitution was amended to make the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister on the President binding. So there are exceptions to these in terms of the power of the President to veto certain decisions or legislations subject to certain rules and regulations, which we have already discussed in the form of various types of vetoes, including absolute veto, pocket veto and suspensive veto. So that does not require any further detailed elaboration here. So the point to be noted is that though the terminology used under the constitutional provisions pertaining to Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers is aid and advice, in actuality it is the advice that is binding upon the President, except and otherwise wherein there are certain exceptions. So moving ahead, what is the membership of the Council of Ministers at the central level, and how are they appointed? As we've already discussed, in accordance with the constitutional provisions under Article 75, it is the President on the advice of the Prime Minister who appoints all the other members of the Council of Ministers. So just like the Prime Minister, the members of the Council of Ministers can also originate either from the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha, and even non-members in certain circumstances are eligible to be appointed as ministers directly, subject to the caveat, subject to the condition that within 6 months of appointment as ministers at the Council of Ministers, they should be elected either as a member of the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. So what it means is that even a non-member of the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha can be nominated or can be appointed by the President, subject to the condition that he or she elects himself or gets nominated to either House of the Parliament within the period of 6 months from their date of appointment as ministers. And in respect of the functioning of the ministers, it is important to note that under Article 88 of the Constitution, a person who is a member of the Council of Ministers, that is a central minister, he is empowered to join and take part as well as speak in the proceedings of either house of the Parliament. So what it means is that as a minister of the central government, a person is entitled to go across the houses, that is even in a house in which he or she is not a member, they are permitted to enter, take part and speak in the proceedings. The only restriction is that a person who is a member of a particular house, though is permitted to speak and take part in the proceedings of another house by virtue of his status as a minister, cannot vote in the other house. So what it means is that a member of the Union Council of Ministers who is elected from the Lok Sabha, he can go to the Rajya Sabha, speak and take part in the proceedings of the Rajya Sabha but he will not be allowed to vote in respect of any matter which comes up for decision making before the Rajya Sabha. So this cross movement of ministers for the purposes of debate, taking part in the proceedings and speaking is permissible under the Constitution, Article 88. So moving ahead, we will be discussing